Hey friends, it's election season. No surprise there, as we're already being inundated with all kinds of political commercials and the like, and unfortunately this is going to be in our face for the next several months, but there's good news on the way. It's our podcast today. We're going to be talking about the importance of transcendent truth as the foundation of liberty and as a protection against government overreach, and we're also talking about something you probably never heard discussed from a biblical perspective, and that's the whole issue of taxation. How do we know if taxes are good, taxes are bad, taxes are legit, or taxes are a result of government overreach? Well, we're going to start exploring some of those things in our podcast today, and I think you'll find it very, very interesting, especially in light of the fact that a national election is forthcoming. Hope you'll tune in.
Hey, welcome to the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast.
We're here again doing the important work of connecting the Lordship of Jesus Christ to everyday life, and what a blessing that is to know that Jesus Christ is Lord, not just of the human heart, but of every single thing. So as you're reading the headlines every day or you're listening to the news, I hope you're making these connections with us. We're going to talk about something today in just a moment that hardly ever gets talked about from a biblical perspective, and that's taxes. But what does the Bible have to say about biblical taxation versus government overreach and some of these kinds of things? So anyway, I hope it's going to be eye-opening for you. Of course, we're working through a book that we just introduced you to. Pastor Andrew, you want to hold that cover up for everybody? Mere Christendom by Doug Wilson, Pastor Doug Wilson. Some of you have already purchased that book and have assured me that you're enjoying it and working through with us. We like to use that as a jumping off place. And why don't you wrap up? You know, Sunday was kind of a big day around here.
Yeah, yeah, it was. We had our grand opening after our collapse of our roof in the youth room. So it was a lot of moving parts. And we were so thankful that we were able to have our grand opening, still be on schedule. Yep. And it was a great day. I mean, we had turned out a little higher than we expected, which was great.
We were expecting about 20% bump, being new, first time in the sanctuary and all that.
Yes, and whatnot. And it was like a 33% bump, almost to the number. And so we had, good problems. Yeah. But there were some issues too. But we're in the process of solving it and coming up with innovations and
these, like you say, problems, but good problems. So we're so grateful for all that the Lord's doing. And first service was maximum capacity on day one, which is kind of exciting and scary all at the same time.
Parking lot was max capacity, a little bit beyond max capacity.
Some of that will change, we hope, this week with our children's ministry, and we'll explain more on a separate video.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of those things.
But yeah, so good stuff happening. Yeah. We're grateful for everybody's patience and for joining us for the big celebration. Plus, we had another great open house too.
We had a great open house. But I mean, I remember when we first started doing children's check-in in the old sanctuary. I mean, we had a slew of issues too. We have to adjust and pivot, and every week we're making little bit improvements here. We're learning every week. And, we're doing the same thing. Yeah. We had to make a major pivot in which that we lost basically our older kids section.
Right. I think third through fifth grade or second through fifth grade?
Second to fifth grade, we had to kind of put them all together. We had to put them in sanctuary. So that was a big pivot. And then first grade had to go with our younger kids. So there was a major pivot in the week we had to do. This week, we shouldn't have to do that anymore. Yeah. So it solves a lot of the issue right then and there. So.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have more by next week, more to share with you on moving forward, especially with the what we're calling the Sunroof Project. S-O-N, Sunroof. Yes. So anyway, but we'll fill you in on that. Yeah. We're in election season. Surprise! You guys are already seeing all of that. And I think this book will be a good, again, guide for us as we're walking through to talk about a lot of important things. Last week, we talked about the wickedness of secularism and the absolute failure of secularism. And I think it's important for people to connect these dots. We want to equip you as we're moving into another national election. Number one, national elections are vitally important. Number two, we are the government, so it is important in a constitutional republic that we get out and vote, and that we are wise voters and engaged voters and equipped voters. So we're wanting to prepare you for that, but also just helping connect the dots between godly government, biblical government, and wicked, overreaching government, which is what you get when you don't have salt and light. That's all you get. Secular governments, godless governments, by definition, always move towards overreach and tyranny. That's just what happens when you don't have salt and light, in the mix, in the equation, in the recipe. So last week we talked about this radical idea that you and I and everybody who loves Jesus and reads the Bible are really Christian nationalists, because according to the Politico reporter, anybody who believes that rights come from God and not the state is a Christian radical, nationalist. What a profound misunderstanding of history, and also a profound misunderstanding of the true basis for freedom. So I ask you, why is it so important for those of us who love Christ to unashamedly and boldly speak our faith out in the public arena and honor God and recognize that there is a God? What does that have to do with maintaining liberty and freedom for ourselves and for generations to come?
Yeah, the simple answer is that the vacuum of a transcendent authority has to be filled. If it's not God, it's going to be people and government and partisanship.
Yeah.
It's so interesting because in this bid for secularism, it's not like secularism, can't even say it, leads to greater rights. They're simply prioritizing certain rights over other rights.
Right, and as he says, some things are simply off the table from the start. Well, why is abortion off the table from the start? Because God's given us the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not murder. There are certain things that in a constitutional republic are not even up for grabs, but they preserve the rights and liberty and life for everybody, and so. That there again, that's the difference. We start with certain a priori convictions that simply say this is right, this is wrong. Well, who says? Well, God says, and then we work our way down from there.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because under secularism, I say that word now, based on the book we just studied,
yeah.
The Return of Gods, it's not actual secularism. It's actually a disguised sense of neutral field, but really is a worship of different paganistic deities by what they actually promote and by the rights they promote. And we talked about that in our last series.
And not to get off on a bunny trail, but I think this is, the big argument now and debate is, of course, with the grand opening of the Olympics in Paris.
That's exactly what I'm thinking about, yeah.
And so it was either a mockery of the Lord's Supper or it was an accurate picture of Dionysus.
Yeah.
We had did you see that? A bull. We had Dionysus, who's the god of
wine,
of wine and indulgence and all the sexual orgy type stuff. So this is basically a recreation of ancient paganism that we talked about during Jonathan Cahn's book, The Return of the Gods. I mean, here we have it, a global phenomenon. It was a public festival that is going to be dedicated to one God or the other.
It's a public worship fest.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Yeah. So anyway, back to your point, though, regarding there's got to be some transcendent standard, some objective reality by which we determine what's right and wrong, and that God Almighty being the source of our rights, that means human governments cannot take our rights away. And that's a radical concept. It's an American concept. You don't find that concept in other nations and their form of government, but it's deeply rooted in our founding documents.
In secularism, the argument is secularism gives you more rights. No, it simply tells you which rights are more. What are your rights? They simply distinguish different rights, right? Sexual rights over right of life, right?
Right.
Sexual rights over right of speech, right? Or right to practice religion, right?
Yep.
It simply reprioritize what type of. You don't get more. You're just saying these are rights and these are not rights.
Right. You just have a different God determining what those rights are.
Right, and we need to have the eyes and be able to articulate that. It's like, no, it doesn't provide us with more rights. It simply dictates what is a right.
And I think the point you're making is there's no neutrality. Someone is going to step in, some power, some authority. Right. That's the nature of government. Some authority is going to step in and say, well, this is the way it's going to be. And what we want our listeners to understand is if that authority isn't God and we're not rooted in the scriptures, then there's no accountability to those governments, and your liberties have absolutely absolutely no foundation. They're just made up. And that's what happens every political cycle is you hear people creating new rights. They use that word rights all the time, but they never define what that means, and we never hear, well, where did that come from? Is that just something you think, okay, I'm going to get more votes if I say everybody has the right to this? Great, I just got 20 million votes from that voting block. It's all about power. It's all about piecing together a winning coalition, but it's not about truth or genuine righteousness. I like the point that he says here. He says the Christian has a natural point of appeal above every human institution. One of them singly or all of them together can be withstood by one courageous man with an open Bible. Quote, you may not, as Yahweh reigns, do this thing. And he gives the example of John the Baptist and King Herod. And I love this example because King Herod, again, was not a believer, but John the Baptist declared the truth about what God had to say about Herod's behavior. In this situation, it was improper sexual behavior. And John the Baptist spoke to power, and he called him out. And the basis of his authority was God. And he goes on to say here, life is simple. God outranks the king. The king is to do what God says, not the other way around. And he asked an important question for the secularist: what outranks the highest human authority? If we are to have rights at all, in the strong sense, they must come from God. God-given rights cannot be revoked by the agency of men. And he brings out something really good. Sometimes we have people like the secular conservative folks who like to, champion things like lower taxes and, stuff like this, but hard work, thrift, saving, all that kind of stuff. But again, without a transcendent basis for their belief, they are no match to stand up against the secularists, because you get into a battle of, well, who says? And then you get into a power struggle. And so at the end of the day, secular conservatism and, he says, secular libertarianism are impotent against the collectivist idol of the state. And I love this quote here. He's a very witty writer. He says the secular conservative wants industry, thrift, and hard work. Oh, and low taxes. The secular libertarian wants to smoke pot and marry another guy. But neither of them have any ultimate standard to which the overweening state must submit. Under the authority of Christ, not only should I be free, but so should my neighbor be, in the same way and on the same terms. And the only way that creates that kind of freedom, the only system that works in that kind of freedom, is the system that acknowledges God Almighty and divine law. So anyway, I would just say this. For too often, we've been, because of the faulty understanding of separation of church and state, we've been silenced. And so if you want to start sharing, well, that's wrong, and you want to start making a moral judgment, and you go back to the Bible, normally you're slapped down in some public arena, like, please keep your Bible to yourself. But we should not allow that to happen. We should be bold. We should say, thus saith the Lord. This is what God says, and we should do it unashamedly. Because if we don't have that standard, tyranny is coming, and we're seeing it ramping up all around us.
Yeah, you and I were just talking about this before the podcast started. I'm no historian, but in general, what I've read is that every couple hundred years there is some type of revolution. And what typically happens, from what I read, is basically the state becomes more and more powerful, more and more entitled.
And unaccountable. And there is a time which the people rise up. And again, we're praying and asking, and sometimes it's a bloodless revolution. It's a peaceful transfer of power. It was like it's a swelling of ego in the state, and that balloon needs to be popped, and hopefully done in a bloodless way. And we've seen just by historically, I think, if I'm trying to think of the leader's name, but back in the Philippines, the people rose up and they were removed from power. There was not a conflict between military and the civilians, and a lot of bloodshed, like you said. But it was because the people rose up, they filled the streets, and the leader realized, okay, I do not have the support of the people any longer, and if I don't submit and get out of town, I'm going to be dead. But again, it was peaceful in the sense that it didn't resort to widespread violence. That's what needs to happen in America. Because I think a lot of people are getting, the average man, the little guy, is getting very, very upset with the two-tiered system of justice, lack of accountability.
Lack of account, swallowing of the tyrannical government. Now, my question is, what happens every couple hundred years? Like, what is there a system that we can keep the government in this rightful place? And I think the solution to that, based on what this, is that there is a understanding that we are submitted under God. There's a restraint on government theologically, logically, institutionally. There's a submission under a transcendent force or authority that says this is our limit and boundary for the state. And for that to happen, you have to have a sense of God to do that. When you don't have that, you know what? Natural human progression is swells and leads to some type of revolution.
And he brought up the point. It's human nature. So even for Christians, it's not something that we can just, we don't have that problem. No, as human beings, we all have that problem. It's just that it is absolutely inevitable for the secularists because, as we pointed out, they have no restraining power in their lives at all. Once they're in charge, they do everything they can to stay in charge, and they keep encroaching God-given boundaries, which is why this is a wonderful transition, I think, to our topic today on taxes. You know, if I said to you, when's the last time in church you heard a sermon on just taxation, or what Jesus has to say about taxes? We don't generally talk about these things, but this is why I love biblical worldview so much, is because the Bible does talk about taxation. And he brings out the point that you were just alluding to. He said one of the most precious possessions a government has is its moral legitimacy. In other words, people have to believe in government to submit to government. And as he says here, I like the language. He says, when the ruling elites start to opt out of this societal bond, in other words, quote, laws are for the little people, not for us ruling elites, there's usually a time lag, but the little people do catch on, and when they catch on, the whole thing spirals down into chaos. So, you look at taxation. For people to pay their taxes, they have to do it voluntarily. In other words, they have to believe in the moral legitimacy of the tax rate. Like, okay, we have to run the government, and okay, this seems like a fair amount to be asked to have all the common things that we have right in a society like ours. But when you see the system abused or rigged, eventually the little guy goes, wait a minute, and you cannot hire enough IRS agents. When you lose moral legitimacy, you cannot hire enough IRS agents to enforce paying taxes, because when people get sick and tired of the government, they say, look at these elite politicians who are basically working the system for their own good. And here I am working 3 jobs to try to raise my kids or whatever. Forget it, and they will find every way they can not to pay taxes. Yeah. Even though, again, there is a legitimate place for taxes, and we're witnessing this right now in Venezuela. We saw this even. I gave the example last week about Jeroboam and Rehoboam. What was the issue there? Excessive taxation. The people were under a heavy burden, while their elitist leaders lived in wealth and opulence. And finally, they just said, hey, you either lift the burden or we're leaving. We're not following you any longer. And I think that's what's happening. Like I said, watching the news in Venezuela, a massive uprising and demanding justice in their elections. And of course, it is a communist country. So talk about pulling down statues, or socialist country. They're pulling down socialist leaders' statues all across the land. Yeah. And anyway, I think there is a massive awakening happening there. But he says here, a free people live under laws passed by legislatures in which they have freely chosen representatives. And he says one of the central techniques that's used by despots for divesting themselves of moral legitimacy is a technique of governing through arbitrary administrative law. And what we're talking about there is this host of regulatory agencies. I'll give you a few. FDA, NHO, National Health Organization, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, National Institutes of Health, NIH. There's a host of alphabet names in Washington. And here's the problem. None of them are there as elected officials. None of them are there by the vote of the people. These are administrative agencies. These are good ideas the politicians came up with. And the problem is, if the EPA tells you, you can't cut that tree down,
Yeah, what recourse do you have?
Who says I can't cut the tree? Well, the EPA says. Well, who gave the EPA the power? I never had a vote on that. That was never brought up before the Indiana legislature. My representative never got to weigh in on that. That's an illegitimate law. Where did that come from? And why in the world do I have to listen to the EPA? And again, we have a whole host of this alphabet soup. And so if a president is lawless and does not want to go through the constitutional means, running it by the will of the people, they'll either do it through courts. We've seen that, judicial activism. They'll do it through divine fiat, where they just make an executive order, or they'll do it through the alphabet soup of regulatory agencies.
We even talked about this a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the Supreme Court of Chevron versus whatever, I don't remember.
Yep.
It was a Supreme Court basically saying these agencies, help me remember, like basically these agencies, their rights should be curtained. They can't just make up their own law. They actually had to submit to like congressional law.
Exactly.
Which is crazy to me that the Supreme Court had to say that, even had to say that.
But let's just say this out loud. Why are we talking about this? Because as Christians, if you want to live free and you want to maintain the freedom of your society, you have to know the source of the freedom and you have to know your rights. Like, I don't want to keep harping on this, but for me, the issue during COVID was crystal clear. We were not having the vote or the words of the people or the input of the people on COVID policy. It was all top down. It was the justification was a health crisis. Therefore, the health experts were making policy, and they were making really bad policy, and they were making politically based policy. And again, if we're grounded in biblical truth, somebody should have been saying, "Wait a minute. Does our governor have the authority to shut down our schools? Does our governor have the authority to shut down businesses? Does our governor have the authority to determine what stays open and what gets closed?" And then the bigger question is, why and who? Where does that authority come from? These are questions that we should be asking, but many times Christians just roll over. We're afraid to push back. We're afraid we're not quite sure we're right. And so when a government official says, "Because I said," or "Because this is the recommendation," then we just roll over. And the minute you roll over, you're literally handing your freedom to, again, an unelected bureaucrat who's making up the rules. And as we saw, this is the biggest frustrating thing, all this expert, whatever it is, was a bunch of baloney because it was all wrong. Wear a mask, false. Put stupid signs on the floor so you walk in, you're not walking close to people. False. Stay 6 feet apart in the airport until you get on the plane and sit 2 inches apart from a person. That was stupid. You can only take your mask down if you're eating a pretzel. That's stupid. I mean, the whole thing was stupid, but nobody would say it's stupid. It was like the emperor's running around naked, and we're afraid to say, "No, that's stupid. I'm not going to do that." We better learn to say that, is what we're trying to say. Because if you don't push back against illegitimate government, you end up with tyranny. And we had the alphabet soup of tyranny, and none of it is legitimate. And so we have to call government out when it's illegitimate. He says here, when there's no standard above the state becomes the standard. And if there's no God above the system becomes the God. We're currently living under a form of government that our Constitution was explicitly designed to prevent. So he says we're already experiencing all kinds of tyranny because we're violating the Constitution left and right. But here's the deal. We had to fight in Indiana to get civics training back in our high schools. In other words, our high school students should read the Constitution. How can you remain a free people if you don't even know what the Constitution says? Yeah. And that's by design. I think there are those who don't want our next generation to read the Constitution because they want to do whatever they want to do. And they don't like the Christian roots of our Constitution and the biblical ideas behind our Constitution. And so, we had to fight in Indiana to make sure every high school student before they graduate actually had a class in government that had them read the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. This should be mandatory reading and mandatory training for anybody that wants to remain free, right?
Absolutely.
That's the foundation of it.
Yeah, mandatory training for anyone who wants to be a citizen and vote, to understand what your vote means. and how precious that vote is, and how easily it could be taken away.
Yeah, absolutely. And so ignorance is a powerful tool in the hands of the elite, because as long as they know the rules or how to get around them and you're stupid, then you're going to lose your freedom because you're stupid. I mean, let's just call it like it is. Ignorance is not bliss. So that's why I'm so grateful for the class that we're having. I got cut a little short this time with the accident, but the biblical citizenship class and some of these courses that we offer on a regular basis, Christian worldview classes, I encourage all of our listeners, educate yourself on the foundations of freedom, unless you just want to be a slave or your children to be a slave.
I think a question that we all need to learn to ask, which is what probably our founding fathers asked, is what gives you authority for this? What gives you the right to ask for this or the power to say this? And if we all ask that question, and then, well, it's because my manager told me so. Well, who gave your manager the power? And you start going backward. I mean, we all need to be asking that, going back and saying, who says? What makes you be able to say that? We start going backwards down that train, we're going to realize, pretty quickly the emperor has no clothes on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But we need to actually ask that question.
Yeah. So we get back to the legitimacy of taxes. He points out something that is very, very important. He said stealing, obviously, is a sin. When God prohibits stealing, this assumes the institution of private property. When God prohibits adultery, what is in the background? Unless there is such a thing as marriage, you cannot have adultery. Adultery is defined as a violation of marriage vows. In the same manner, he says stealing is a violation of someone's right to remain in possession of their own property. So let's just pause here. Our legal system and justice system was absolutely founded on the Ten Commandments. The reason we protect private property, the reason we're not all Marxists, is because if the Bible says thou shalt not steal, it assumes that you have the right to own something, because stealing means I take something that does not belong to me. When the Bible says not to covet your neighbor's possessions, it means you should not look at what your neighbor owns and look at it in a jealous way and say, well, it's not fair. You have more than me. You need to give me half of what you have so that we're equal. No, these are all foreign concepts to the Scripture, and yet these are concepts that are being promoted all over our world today. The whole idea of equity is not equal opportunity, but equal outcomes. In other words, it's not enough to just give people an equal opportunity to get an education or to work hard or to invest or save or start a business. No, you have to make sure that I get the same benefit as you, even though you might work harder, sacrifice more, all those things. It doesn't matter. All they care about is equal outcomes. And these principles go right in the face against the grain of all we learn in Scripture. So when you hear these phrases, and this one gets me set off, when you hear Joe Biden or the left saying things like, we all need to do our fair share. Billionaires, you need to do your share. What they're basically saying is we're going to steal from you, or we're going to steal from you even at a higher rate than we steal from the average guy. What's the basis for stealing more or taxing a billionaire more than taxing me? There should be no basis for that. In other words, the billionaire made his money or her money, and it's her money. Government doesn't have the right to say, well, you have more and this person has less, so I'm going to charge you 70 or 80%, which is what Kamala Harris has suggested, taxing up to 70. Think about this. Who in their right mind would give the government the permission to take 70 or 80% of what you work your butt off every day to raise, and somehow they're going to all baptize that under the banner of do your share? Like, what is that?
These billionaires, even if that law's, they have so many donors who are billionaires. So like, it's all just words. Because these billionaires, if those laws are actually passed, this billionaire will simply shelter their finances in some type of account somewhere else. And they have ways around this. This is just all rhetoric, right?
It is.
Our tax code is so
power-based
complicated.
rhetoric, and it's jealous. It's rooted in jealousy. If I can get the
people,
if I can get the little person who doesn't have anything to feel jealous about the big person, we forget. Like even again, Bill Gates. Of course, he's no conservative. He's no Christian. So he's not somebody we're putting up on our Christian pedestal. But for instance, he made all of his money by creating a project, a product that serves people. He didn't put a gun to anybody's head. People went out and bought his computer. Why'd they buy his computer? Because it worked, because it made their life easier. He didn't do anything wrong to become a billionaire. He actually served the world with the product that he helped create. So why in the world are we jealous of that guy, and why in the world are we trying to steal his money and say, do your fair share? So next week, hold your horses, because I think this is important. We're going to get into, obviously the Bible talks about taxes, and there's actually a justification for taxes, but not all taxes. So how do you know when the government overreaches in the area of taxation? That's a great question. How do you know when you're evaluating a candidate and what their fiscal policies are? How do you know if that person is worthy of your vote? It's a great question. Yeah. So we're going to get into a lot of this next Thursday. We hope you will come back for more. And more importantly, I hope you'll begin taking these principles and then just applying them as we're moving into this election season, applying them to the options before us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good stuff.
Yeah, there's so much we can talk about. I mean, the whole idea of taxes and billionaires, because there's so many things. My thought is there's so many things that these billionaires are doing that's wrong that we turn a blind eye to.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But my point was, if somebody makes $1 billion the right way by simply creating a product or service that people value. There's nothing immoral about that. Now, if they're lying and cheating along the way.
That's what I'm saying. It's like we pass these laws that gets ordinary Americans, restricts ordinary Americans doing the right way. It's just like you said, people who just work hard and become very wealthy, like they should be incentivized to become wealthy, right?
Yeah, the person that's a couch potato who's watching soap operas all day or doing nothing should not get a dime from the person who's working their tail end off, unless they voluntarily donated. That's the only way.
Right, we focus our energy passing tax bills that restrict hardworking Americans, whereas there's all these illegal things, like insider trading, all these different things that these elites do that we don't do. We turn a blind eye to, and we say so. To me, even in middle of all that, there's a lot of hypocrisy.
So all these politicians that come into office, like middle class people, some are rich, but and then you look at their net worth when they leave.
Right.
Okay. Every American should be saying, how in the world do you start off as a kid that grew up in relative poverty, and now you own 4 homes, while you tout climate change hysteria and having a small carbon footprint, but you have 4 oceanfront homes? I mean, this is the kind of thing we should be asking questions about. Like, how did that happen?
No laws should be passed to prevent that.
Yeah,
right?
Where did you get that money from?
Right.
Or when you're the Bidens and you have 20-some shell companies that you're hiding money in, and we still can't get a conviction and throw you in jail. That's a problem, because this is not normal behavior. This is mafia-like behavior, and the average American looks at that and just goes, and you're taking away my what now? I got to pay more here. Or you're taking away my child tax credit, or whatever the situation is. I mean, you just and that's the kind of stuff that leads to revolutions, because people finally just are sick and tired of it. They reach a breaking point. All right. Well, hey, enough fun for today. And I was just thinking, you're like, oh man, there's so much we can talk about. Yeah. We get to talk until Jesus comes.
That's right.
Which is pretty fun.
Plenty of material there.
Think of how many podcasts are down the road in the future that we haven't even explored yet. Does that make you excited or tired?
It does. And tired. Excited and tired at the same time.
All right. Well, hey, we've had enough fun. You guys have a great day. We'll look forward to being with you next week.